Are the terms basic income, citizens' dividend, are they actually helpful for the conversation? One of the problems we had last week, just to explain this, is basic income seems to suggest it's something to do with earning a wage that you're due, and it seems to go back to something to do with working. And citizens' dividend is this strange thing as well. So are any of these terms any good?
I think citizens' income implies that it's nothing to do with work and that there's some kind of basic thing that we're all citizens. It implies some universal entitlement.
What, even though it's got the word income, it seems to be something to do with working for it, doesn't it?
Well, wage would mean you have to work for it. That's why it's not citizens' wage.
Well, we're going to come on to another question which is going to discuss where the money comes from. And the reason I like the word dividend is that if we think about the current economy, the people at the top of society are receiving the dividends that by right should belong to everybody. So they're getting the interest, but leaving the interest aside, they're getting dividends from the land, from resources, from all the commons. They are receiving those dividends, and I feel quite strongly that one, this should be unconditional, two, it should apply to every citizen, and three, that it should be a dividend rather than income, which, if you think about income tax, income does imply, whether it's correct or not, people associate income with doing something for income as opposed to just receiving it. Whereas a dividend is unequivocally something that is a sharing of the excess or the profit from an enterprise or from the land or from whatever. So
and it's your due.
Yeah, exactly. That's I think that's conveyed in the word dividend.
It doesn't mean gift dividend. It does mean no. It doesn't.
It does not. No.
A dividend is basically what is due to any stakeholder or shareholder. So in a company environment, all the shareholders get dividends. Now, obviously, you have different classes of shareholdings, but leaving that aside, in a basic joint stock enterprise or in a community, then everybody should be entitled to the dividend. And again, we're going to come on to where the money comes from. But basically, we are all entitled to a share of that dividend, an equal share of that dividend, rather than it being assigned on some basis that's evolved by accident, which is what happens at the moment.
In terms of income, I suppose people, if you're not earning an income, that would probably reinforce the whole view of, income sort of that does imply working, you have to do something for it. On the other side of that, at the same time, dividend, it's probably not like, for someone not in, it's not an everyday term that a lot of people, what is a dividend? Because, unless, I know what a dividend is, but, like, it's not common currency in terms of people just talking about dividends.
Well, years ago, when people belonged to the co-op, they would receive a dividend. So
because it's not common now, that's why it's not used.
It's an accident. It's fallen out of usage.
Yeah.
But I think it wouldn't. We have to recapture language, and basically, I think the fact that people don't know about it is in some senses a positive, because you explain that a dividend is your entitlement rather than being a handout or something that you need to justify. So while I take your point, it's not well understood, it's an opportunity to educate people about the whole concept of, and you can talk about the co-ops, that all the people in the co-op used to get a divvy. And you talk to people of my generation who were part of the co-op, and that will be familiar to them. The problem is that it's fallen out of usage.
Mm.
But it
And,
needs to be brought back.
and that kind of ties into. I'm with Paul on that with dividend. I find it a strange word as well because it's just a little
Alien.
bit, after, slightly before me, but I do know the word. But I think it's quite interesting when you're talking about language as well, about this and the terminology of these things, and trying to almost. Well, Mario mentioned it to do with the food thing, having problems with the words as we know them, and Ray Sheath has mentioned in the past as well about problems with words and what they mean and how they kind of stop the conversation in a way.
But the great thing about dividend is that the people who currently enjoy the dividends, which are the rich and the elevated cattle, you know, the upper middle classes, they understand what a dividend is.
True.
And therefore, when one's trying to convey that the sense of unfairness that they are getting dividends that they're not entitled to, then that begins to open up a discussion that actually crosses class barriers. But there is a re-education or an education process in terms of the people who don't know the term.
We think with words, and unless we have a word for a thought, we can't really communicate about it. So quite often new words need to be brought into use, or lost words needs to be recovered.
Yeah.
And the active dividend is one of those, that you contribute some benefit and you get a return when once that contribution produces a fruit. That's what dividend is. You enable a company to start because you put in capital, and when this profit starts happening, you get a share, which you have to initiate.
Could I just to round this one question up then? Is anybody more in? It's a bit of a basic question, but anyone more in favour of basic income, or are people more in favour of citizens' dividend, or what was there was a word before citizens? Unconditional citizens' dividend.
I think for the sake of ease of uses, it's probably best not to use unconditional. It gets quite cumbersome. But I think where one is writing papers for people who are going to look at this more deeply, I think using the word unconditional is valid. But I think if one gets citizens' dividend, because unconditional citizens' dividend is quite a mouthful, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I think basic income or citizens' dividend, I would vote for the latter personally.
Yeah, citizens' dividend.
And also it kind of indicates how it is funded. If you use the word dividend, it implies that once you get familiar what a dividend is, it's earned, in a sense.
Yes, I think it's a bit of a mouthful, but for the reasons that you say that it's new, it can't get mixed up with something else.
Which leads us on to the second question. Are we actually talking about a resource, and the way that we are trying to reimagine how that resource is divided and distributed? Is that what we're talking about with the citizens' dividend?
If you go into detail, yes, the issue comes up. In a sense, it's like, the Alaska source of citizens' dividend is their oil extraction, their oil reserves. So they say that that oil, okay, it is free from nature, but it belongs to all of us, not just the people who pump it onto the surface and sell it. So the details would actually insist on explaining the mechanics.
But that's quite interesting about the discussion on resource then, because Mary mentioned earlier about work in the house or tidying something or doing something. So does that mean a resource is only a product, or is it something that's shared in what we do every day in life? Can it be that's part of the whole resource that we're sharing, or is it? Do we need something to produce finance that then we share and then we have a life? Or is it more integrated into everything that happens within a society?
I think from starting from here, I think it would be very difficult to convey the totality of everything being a shared resource. I just think people would balk at that. But I think intellectually it's very easy to make a distinction between what people are entitled to retain for their own use and what should be shared. And there are essentially two tests. One is it God or man created, or nature or man created? And the other test is, if it's communally created, then the value should be shared. So either it's there because of the universe and nature, or it's there because people collectively have created value. So whether it be knowledge, whether it be airport landing slots, whether it be location value in terms of rents, those are all things that are communally created. Now, in the sense of land satisfies both those tests, because one, it's nature given, and two, its value is created communally, both by if you take Bond Street, for example, it's all the people who frequent Bond Street, it's all the people who have shops there, it's all the people who've paid for transport links there, so that everybody has paid for that. So essentially land satisfies both requirements. Knowledge only satisfies the collective creation rather than the natural creation, although you could argue that as part of nature. But I think that's quite distinct from saying that we should share the value of whatever anybody does. I think that's just too big a stretch. One may get there in a utopian vision of the future where you actually are sharing the value of the commons and everybody does have the means to life as of right. Then extending the way we think about sharing becomes a much easier proposition. But from where people are now, where they're so insecure and desperate they're worried about the future, they think, well, I have to keep stuff to myself, whereas in a totally different environment, people will become much more open to sharing what they do and not counting the cost. In the same way, that people who do the sort of stuff we're doing here, we don't count the cost of what we do. Do you ever sit down and calculate the hours you spend on this?
That's right, time is money. Oh, I spend 2 hours, £20 please.
Yeah, I mean, I've never sought to quantify the value of what I do outside of work, basically.
Yeah, so but in your case, you've got some other work that's going on, probably not as many hours as before, but you sort of allocated it so that you've given yourself some time to do
my
this.
point is that when you get into a position where you don't have to worry about how you live, and I guess most of us are in the position where we still have to worry about how we live and we deal with it. But if you imagine all that pressure being removed, and you can get up in the morning, you can decide to do what the hell you like because your life is your own, then one's attitude to sharing your resource, your time and what you do with other people becomes much less of an obstacle or a hurdle to cross. So I think in the first instance we have to define it quite narrowly, but with a view to expanding that discussion once we get there.
But I think Eddie was talking about the wages for housework, specifically about, do people get paid for doing work in their own home? And what is your, supposing you're in, you don't have this basic income, you've got children, your husband works but it's not enough, you've got to go out to scrub somebody else's floor instead of scrubbing your own floor.
Mhm.
And you try to do both, but you're under a hell of a lot of pressure.
Yeah, that's the current paradigm. What we're
Yeah.
talking about here is
So-
if there is a citizens' dividend, where is it being funded from? Is it being funded from the things I described, the commons, or is it being funded from everybody's activity, whatever it may be? So I was trying to make a distinction between one's work that one's doing for whatever reason, either through necessity or through desire, actually separating that out from the things that are rightfully everybody's, as opposed to being the ownership or in the sort of control of the person creating that value. Does
I
that
think
make
Yeah.
sense?
in this society, we've got infrastructure, we've got, you know, activity that's industry, and we have things like the underground that are established, you know, that have been paid for or created by previous labour, ingenuity and labour.
Yeah.
And if you think about a country, I'm thinking of, you know, somewhere in the desert where there's no buildings, there's no sewers, and people are scratching. There's a drought and they haven't even been able to feed themselves. That's an entirely different situation. It's because we are benefiting from the infrastructure that's been built by the work of previous generations that we can even, you know, talk about creating money and just sharing it out. So it's actually not through any right. It's through our good fortune that we're in a place where this infrastructure has been built. And if you go back in history, it wasn't there, and it still isn't there in some countries.
The concept of inheritance from previous generations is very much part of the overall picture here, because all the things we can possibly achieve here is possible because we have inherited all the know-how that previous generations
So the
had
question
to
is
work.
whether that inheritance is shared.
Well, it's right, and at the moment it is not shared. A business tycoon takes all that inheritance as granted, gratis, and builds his empire and prides himself. But let's see Bill Gates, built his empire without the invention of the semiconductor, for example.
Well, putting the record straight on Bill Gates, he originated nothing. He stole his ideas, but that's something entirely different.
It's worse.
But
it's actually worse.
I think inheritance comes under the heading of communally created value, and therefore it's covered in the two definitions that I offered as.
Yes. Okay. That's right.
Paul, do you want to?
No,
Could I just, because what I said earlier was mentioned by Mary and yourself, but I still think there is place for this. What has been mentioned here in most of the cases is things that in the present paradigm are given a value, and given a value of understanding to do with wealth or wealth creation. And I've got a funny feeling, just to put it on the record, that until we start to value the things that aren't those things, then this big change is not going to come. And I don't think it could exist without the other, the momentum. I think it's interesting you say, and I agree with you, that people would balk at it, and as you say, that one has to be put in place to allow it to develop. But I still think that it's important to include the fact that everything needs to be considered, and particularly moving away from just the things that are valued monetarily.
Yeah. I think to some extent that's the rationale of a citizen's income, that you're actually disconnecting the means to life from paid employment, and it's an entitlement by virtue of being alive, and therefore it's a reward for everything you do rather than for something specific that you may do.
Is referring to Labour, the Labour Party, unions, labour force helpful to the conversation needed for 2016 and beyond?
And related to citizens' dividend, or
In relation to a new economic paradigm, does Labour have a role to play in terms of, is it a significant factor? I find it quite frustrating that most of the people of the left are embedded in 20th century politics in terms of labour versus capital.
yeah,
And I think we have Marx to thank for this.
yeah,
The idea that the workers somehow are a collective. They are no longer a collective.
yeah,
In fact, the workers are no longer necessary to a large extent. Yes, there is work to be done, but the classic model of you get a job and you work 40 hours a week or whatever the designated working week is, and if you work overtime you get time and a half and all, that whole paradigm is gone. So much so, and it broke really probably around 1970 and really started to come off. The wheels really started to come off when Thatcher and Reagan came to power, and the gap between what people were actually being given in return for their labour and the shortfall, if you like, of what was being stripped out was actually filled by borrowing, and that's essentially what's happened. The credit card debt and all the mortgage debt and all this, and it's still going on today. That is keeping the thing together. The other thing that's keeping together is the creation of non-jobs, ever decreasing wages. So workfare and Mac jobs and 0-hour contracts.
Yeah.
So I don't think personally that Labour is at all helpful in this dialogue.
No, that is the big problem of the current labour movement. They are locked into this pre-industrial concept,
Well,
where
pre-21st century concept, I would say.
Well,
It is industrial concept.
you see, for the problem with Marx, he could not really appreciate what technology was going to do to society.
Yeah.
The competence of automation, which happened, let's say from the beginning of the 20th century, was you couldn't really foresee how complex and capable machines that we can invent.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Because I suppose it's being decoupled, like economic, like the growing economy. Like I've read an article today about what's happening in the States, and the fact that some jobs have gone due to NAFTA, but some jobs have just gone because they're gone.
Yeah. And then never come back.
Yeah, but then there's still that idea that actually those jobs can come back,
Yeah.
So if those jobs aren't going to come back because actually they are gone, that means that labour component, they're not under the existing paradigm. There's going to be no pay for those people who are providing labour. So actually, it does become.
Well, the current economic paradigm is premised on supply and demand. And
Totally.
if you apply that to labour, then clearly nobody's going to be able to afford to live because there's too much supply and not enough demand. So you may get a few people who get enough to live on because they're in demand.
Yeah.
If they happen to be
White collar generally.
well, whatever they may be,
Yeah.
people who are good at killing other people, or
true.
all the other things that.
Yeah.
So the whole concept of the labour force is redundant. We need to move on from that and disassociate it from.
I suppose
Yeah, but there still are, right now, there still are some jobs that need to be done, and the the big question that's going to come up is, if you're the sort of person who's going to, the kind of job that you could get is something quite tough to do. It could be, you know, working a long shift in a hospital, or, you know, what would make you want to do that work rather than just go for a walk that day? So, you know, this, and in the past, when we had the labour force, people were doing tough jobs in order to survive, but what they created on top of that was this sense of solidarity and community. So that was, when you think of these men going down the mine, that's the, you know, to my mind, it's the sort of toughest thing you can think of, you know, being in the dark all day and doing all these things. But they had camaraderie,
But that was a
solidarity,
kind of compensation.
and yeah, and they had pride in what they were doing, as well as the money. And one of
it's
the
a
things,
compensation. It's not their thing.
yeah,
that
but when those jobs disappeared, it wasn't just that they didn't get the money, it was that they had the bottom knocked out of their raison d'etre. You know, they took it on that they were doing those tough things, and they formed these communities.
Well,
and
it's the same with soldiers
So-
in war.
Yeah,
They
okay,
will say
yeah.
that the camaraderie. You
But
can't
if-
imagine what.
what's got
felt
to
like.
be figured out, and the figures have got to be figured out, is that if everybody gets a certain amount of money just for waking up in the morning, you know, who's going to bother to do any work?
That's the
If
problem.
you're one of those people who can only do, you know, these tough jobs, you're not going to do the tough job if you can just stay in bed and get the basic income. So you've got to work out the figures of what's going to incentivise people, and that's
Okay.
the question that people are going to ask. Why would you do any work?
The frustrating thing that all these questions have been dealt with for decades, and they are in books. If we care to find out what somebody else found out, instead of us wanting to reinvent the wheel. All these, there are answers to everything you just mentioned. I'm sorry, I lose patience because
I'm talking about politics.
Hold
the
it a minute.
answers are there. Let's find the books and start using what other people spend time and effort to research. And then we can build on that.
I was curious still about this language, because Mary's talking about some sort of almost like a heritage and an inheritance of something to do with labour. I'm just curious about that language thing
But
again.
you're talking
to
about
do,
the Labour Party. What is it about
just
the
this
Labour
idea
Party?
of you mentioned it very well by saying the working man, people that can do this hard jobs, stuff like that is a kind of heritage there, and how helpful is that in this is not a criticism, I'm asking a question. How helpful is all of that language, that baggage, in a modern world of moving forward into a different paradigm?
Yeah, well, it's how you can divert that energy into doing something like, why don't we grow some food? You know, it's creating, you know, the aim and the ambition and the solidarity over something that you've decided to do for yourself or for the community without some employer, you know, using your labour to make a profit.
So you feel embedded in that idea of labour, and a labour force is something for the good that can still go forward.
I'm thinking about motivating people. I mean, I went to the permaculture conference, and these people are encouraging each other to learn how to till the soil in a creative way, and to use nature and be in tune and all this. So they're creating a paradigm where they're proud to do what they're doing.
Because it satisfies them. They get
Yeah.
a tremendous satisfaction, and that will be always available to anybody who has got the privilege of deciding how to spend their God-given time. They will find the way, the job, the activity, because humans don't want to be idle. Some people will actually work on the land, grow food, even if they don't get paid for it,
So
because they get the satisfaction from
Well,
working
So,
with
can I
nature.
just ask Janice? So, Janice, do you feel about the language thing that these terms of labour and labour force are detrimental to moving forward,
Yes,
or
because
are they essential?
No, they are out of date because the world has changed. There is no need for that kind of incentive to feel that your dignity comes because you do a good day's work, and any wage you get you have earned. So you are not a skiver or a parasite on the rest of your society.
So what's
But then now, today's world is quite different because you don't have to build the canals with picks and shovels. You got earth-moving equipment to do anything you want to do in terms of constructing railways, for example, or roads. So these concepts are not in line with what the current kind of social and economic situation is
Paul?
made up of.
So what language replaces that? Like, what's, if that's not the language if that's not going to be useful moving forward, how do we need to think about us? If labour's no longer there, how do we think about everyone and what language has to go along with that to convey that same, or a similar, that we've all got self-worth just because, which hasn't been part of the discourse ever.
At the risk of being slightly grandiose, I mean, essentially what we've evolved into is a sort of command and control structure for everything. And what becomes increasingly apparent through our work is that that is not going to get us out of the current problem. It's going to send us down the tubes. And we have to emulate nature. And if you think about nature evolves randomly, interdependently. And so as necessities arise, they will be solved locally amongst local communities. So I think the language that needs to replace this idea of organised labour, which is essentially a sort of monolithic hierarchical concept, is the concept of people, family, communities. And those communities don't necessarily need to be geographical communities. They can be interest-based communities. They can be shared culture communities. They can be shared interests, or geography and time are no longer constraints that they were pre-internet. But we do need to recover that idea of human scale for our activities, because the problem is that having lost human scale, the command and control mechanism means that everybody is powerless. Even those at the top are powerless because they're all part of this machine and they all have to behave according to the incentives of the machine. Whereas if we go for a sort of flat, organic structure for life, then human ingenuity is such that all problems will be solved. And those that aren't solved will be worked around, or like water finds its way down a hill, the solutions will emerge from the ground up. But the big fear is letting go of that sort of command and control structure, which gives the illusion of certainty and security, whereas in fact it's a false paradigm because it's driving us to the abyss, as we can see. So I think the language is more around people, community, family, human scale, but with the application of technology and communication that unleashes a world that was denied any previous generation.
But it's not going to happen overnight. I mean, we're still depending on the just-in-time delivery of the food to the supermarket shelves and all the other, you know, things that we use, you know, chemicals, medicines, and you can't just wish it away overnight. It's not going to happen.
No.
So we are dependent on those systems. I'm worrying about all the, you know, the service industries, the women who are up at 5 o'clock in the morning, cleaning the offices, tidying up the hotels, waiting for the next guests, visiting all the, you know, people in all those tiny one-person cells in the high-rise flats, cleaning them up, and, you know, the hospital workers and all these things. These are not jobs that anybody would choose to do unless they were going to be paid.
Well, that's the issue. That's the point. They would be paid, and that's why they would want to do it, because they want to have a materially comfortable lifestyle. Other people would say, no, I live on my basic income because I want to be an artist or want to.
Yeah, okay, so those things need to be made clear to sell the idea that there is an incentive to actually do some work that you may not choose to do.
Well, yeah, that's why it has to be independent of whether you have earned paid work or not.
How does one deal with accusations that a citizen's income, citizen's dividend, would be giving people something for nothing?
My basic idea is that I don't want to fall over beggars in the street. I would much rather they got the basic stuff so they didn't have to do that.
And they can afford to have their own
you know, that things are so desperate now. You know, these sad people, it upsets me when I walk by
I feel
them.
guilty.
Yeah, and I think that people
Ashamed.
shouldn't be so degraded. I think that there should be something basic without having to prove that you're disabled or where you came from or whatever. Because I don't like tripping over beggars in the street.
You see, the grass doesn't have to justify itself for being there, and it is there, and it is useful. And same with a human being. There should be no need to justify his or her existence, because they are, just by being there, they are making society possible. Without them. Without us, you know, there would be no human civilization. That's one reason why we deserve to be enabled to live. In fact, quite a 180 degrees approach to citizens' dividend is that it enables a person to get up and go to work. The breadwinner in a family is enabled to go and do his job, because there is somebody else who cooks the food or manages the household.
Well, certainly Guy Standing's pilot in India demonstrated that economic activity actually goes up when you give people a basic income, and this was covering over 4,000 people across 28 villages or something like that. And health, all the indicators: health, economic activity, gender emancipation. All those women were empowered. I mean, if you read the, in fact, I'm sure I posted the video on Daily Pickings. If you look up Guy Standing basic income pilot, or just basic income pilot, you'll find it. I would also, let's look at the other end of the telescope. Let's think about when we were talking about the sharing of the dividend, there are a small number of people who are not only getting something for nothing, they're getting everything for nothing.
Yeah,
Duke
And, you know, the Duke of Westminster
Mm-hmm.
is running an empire built on UK and foreign property, which he doesn't have to work, he chooses to. I've actually done some work for the Grosvenor Estates, so I know a bit about them. And he does work, but he chooses to work, but he doesn't have to work.
That's the point.
And he has an extended family, most of whom are sitting back and getting something for nothing. And they're not just getting something for nothing, they're getting a huge amount for nothing. The Queen is sitting in her palace and getting a huge amount for nothing. You may argue that she has to do public engagements, but you know,
She does
She-
do some work.
she doesn't.
She reads the papers as well.
Yeah, well, you know, basically she's looking after her own interests at the end of the day. So the idea that that some human beings can get an extraordinary amount of stuff for nothing, and others have to justify their existence, seems to me to be wholly inequitable.
Well, it's probably following on what was just said. I was thinking, well, just say with Crossrail 2 happening, whoever happens to own land next to wherever they've, you know, all those new stations are going in, they'll be getting they'll be getting something for sort of nothing, just by the fact that actually they were lucky enough. And the word lucky comes in, that you're lucky enough to get that, so therefore you get X. So, yes, so I think that I'd definitely come at it from that angle, because there are people who are doing very well, you know, getting a lot for nothing, and then a lot of people getting just nothing.
So as a sort of counter comment to people going, oh, these people are getting something for nothing.
Yeah.
There are a lot of people already.
So the question is, do we have to take it off them to give it to the others?
Well, that's a different to try and contain it to the thing. But what I thought was interesting about what Yana said about the grass thing not having to justify itself and something. What I find interesting at the moment is what, for want of a better word, is a sort of neoliberal, neoconservative ideology. There's certain people who are very powerful that have an idea of what we should all be doing, and a very specific idea. Now, everybody used to say, oh, these bloody communists, they've written down how we're meant to be living our lives. Now, they supposedly got rid of the communists, but there's a lot of people in very powerful positions who are very bossy, very together, and have very strong ideologies, and they have plans for us.
For other
And
people.
it's
Yes.
usually under a bloody liberal cloak and a conservative cloak, so everybody seems to think this is okay. But if you step a foot out of line, or as Jana says, if you're just getting on with your life, that's maybe not good enough, because it's not actually meeting an agenda that someone in a powerful position wants you to do as an individual on this planet. And that's a worrying thing, I think, about this whole idea of where you fit in the world and everything. And it made me, just when Yanis's comment made me think about that as well. This sort of power from above.
Well, it's sort of their sort of hidden hand of just hurting us where they want us to go to. You know, it's on some level, like they said when you're saying about the communists commanding, you know, what should happen in society. They just do it a little bit more abstractly, and we think we've got a choice in the matter, whereas in fact we're being guided that way to whatever solution they're hoping to achieve.
Well, again, it's not something for nothing, because take the household. In fact, it's called reproduction. In order to be part of society, you have to actually reproduce yourself. So everybody has to do certain things to keep alive before they can be part of society and therefore contribute to society. So everybody works. By us eating and not dying or getting sick and become a burden on the health service, we are actually working to actually keeping ourselves healthy. So there's this concept that work is considered only in terms of economics, i.e. you do a job for somebody else in order to get paid. Now, that is a very narrow note.
Yeah, because at least
We all work by being alive, by keeping ourselves alive.
The concept of the wages for housework is that about half the population are sort of can be busy all day at doing all that stuff, and it's not considered economic.
Mhm.
And when you think about people doing activity, we don't call it work, but that keeps them healthy, like going for a walk, going to the gym, playing games, as opposed to doing something where they're stuck in a desk all day, actually spending half the time doing what looks like work and doing something that keeps you healthy saves a lot of resources it keeps you healthy and saves a lot of resources being spent on the health service.
And for something for nothing, isn't that the whole concept of rent seeking generally? So like, you know, or the creation of money out of nothing,
Yeah.
it's sort of, that's, you know, the power elite, you know, all the people with the most are getting money for nothing.
Yeah, exactly.
Should citizens' dividend, that we're calling it at the moment, include an entitlement to housing?
It's a basic necessity. It includes all basic necessities, sufficient to cover cost of basic necessity. Housing is not the first, the second.
Well,
basically.
we have got a rather complicated system, which I think is being eroded, or being planned to be eroded, whereby people are given council houses. If they're not earning enough money to pay the proper rent, the local authority supplies the extra money that's missing in order to make up the rent, or discounts it, so that everybody gets the council house. Now, if all those council houses are being sold off, the people who are needed to work in the cities have to get shipped out to the suburbs because the price of the property's gone up, so they can't do it. All that is being disrupted. And what I'm saying is, there's quite a lot of money going in, you know, from local authorities, from the available finance, to prop people up so that they can actually have a roof over their head. And one of the attractive ideas about citizens' income is simplifying things. So you don't have to be assessed. They don't have to do so much work doing the numbers. People don't have to prove how disabled they are, etc., etc. So there's an awful lot of non-productive activity going on in our society, where people are doing these calculations, you know, doing these assessments, and it's just going round and round in circles. These people doing this work, it's not productive.
There is the additional factor when it comes to housing, that the whole idea of allowing people to collect, and this comes back to the resource argument, allowing people to collect the surplus value that belongs to everyone else is what's driven the cost of housing up. So if you solve that problem, then housing becomes available to everyone at an affordable price within the parameters of the basic income. And arguably, you know, at a base level, you could probably provide housing for free to people and give them a basic income. And then if people wanted specific housing, they wanted a bigger house, or they wanted a house in a specific location, then the option is there to work to make the extra money to go and do that. But the value of that house wouldn't go up each year the way it does at the moment. It would remain constant. Because, you know, what we have is a paradigm where there is an assumption that if you obtain a house, it's going to go up in value, whereas the reality is the fabric of the house deteriorates over time, and the value should actually go down rather than up. So it's all based on location value. So the whole housing delay is yes, it's partially in the basket of citizens' income, but at the end of the day, if we dealt with land fairly in such a way as to provide the resources to provide a citizens' dividend, we'd solve the housing crisis at the same time.
Yeah, yeah.
And what seems to be the fear of what the way that the citizens' dividends being discussed at the moment? It seems like just a payment that's given to someone. It doesn't seem to be taking into account anything to do with housing or anything.
No, and I think that's one of the problems of citizens' income calculations in the current economic paradigm, not least because if you've got interest still in the equation, then everything's costing double what it should cost for a start.
Yeah.
So it looks much less affordable.
And also, isn't there, if there's no citizens' dividend, that means people are a little bit more, I need to get that house to actually get that value to feel secure.
And,
so
to close that gap between income and what you need to live on, because you're living on your equity, as a lot of people are.
Mm.
So many people are actually living on their equity. That's how they make up the difference, because the value of their house keeps going up.
Yeah.
But just on that, in the cynical world that's of rents and everything else, if you give someone a basic income at the moment, the landlords will take into account this extra bit of money and they'll just shove it onto the rent.
Well, which is why you need to address the land problem at the same
You
time.
can't do it in an isolated.
I think that's where the question came from last week.
I think that's very much the case.
Well, does that suggest confiscation at some stage? Because obviously some people have got a shed load of, as it is now, I have a shed load of houses.
Well, there's a lot of people done work on land value tax, which I don't necessarily subscribe to. One of the ideas that we came up with a while back was that you actually rebase the currency according to land, and you assess the land according to location value or resource value or usage value, which would be fairly straightforward. And then you charge an annual percentage of that, which would fund public services and the citizens' dividend. Now, if somebody's got a huge amount of land, clearly they're going to have to pay quite a lot. So then they have an option either to pay in terms of relinquishing some of their land or by paying the money. So they have a choice.
Okay,
So confiscation doesn't necessarily have to come into it, but there will be an equalisation of wealth over time, because people will either have to find the money, rather than from a rent-seeking perspective, they will actually have to sell off their assets in order to keep funding their lifestyle.
Yeah.
So in time, you equalise society. So no, there is no confiscation, but in time, society would equalise.
Yeah.
Okay.
Not necessarily to be totally equal.
But you could start with some very obvious things, like people who are buying empty flats, not to rent out, but just waiting for the price to go up. It could have to pay the council tax, and
They'd have
those
to pay
rates.
land value tax.
Yeah,
of some
those
sort.
rates could be made penalty rates to encourage them to.
Well, you wouldn't need to if you charged everybody properly for the value that was in the land, so that one wouldn't actually benefit from holding land.
Yeah, that's right.
Then there's no incentive to do it, and therefore it would stop.
Yeah, so a lot of this buying and selling of houses isn't housing people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's
But I mean,
it's
that's
the
like the
system
thin
that
end of the
creates
wedge of where you could start. It's
But
an
it's the
obvious
system
thing.
that creates the opportunity. If you remove the incentives from the system, it wouldn't happen.
But you have to start somewhere. You can't just put in a draconian thing, and that's an obvious place to start.
Well,
that very few people would
you
argue.
could start with a